Hello, and thank you for coming, or thank you for being here. My name's Gaby Wood. I'm very, very pleased to be here with Hermione Lee, who I'm a little bit worried about introducing, actually, because were I to do it properly, you'd be so dazzled by her achievements that you wouldn't be able to listen to anything she said afterwards. So I'll be very brief. She is the president of Wolfson College, Oxford, now, having been a professor of English for many years. She's the biographer of Virginia Woolf, Edith Wharton, Willa Cather, and as a critic, she's written on many other subjects. She is also a kind of philosopher of the art of biography itself, having written 2 books, Body Parts and Biography, a very short introduction on that subject. And she's also the founder of the Oxford Centre for Life Writing at Wolfson College. Her most recent book is a biography of Penelope Fitzgerald, which we'll be talking about today. Which manages to be both magisterial and somehow intimate at the same time. But she is also, don't let that dazzle you too much, one of the cleverest and nicest people I know. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. It's quite mutual.
Shall we, I don't know how much people know about Fitzgerald herself, so perhaps you should tell us a little bit about that first.
Has anybody read her? Yes, great.
Oh,
Some fans, fantastic. She kind of spanned the 20th century. She was born in the war, the First War, and she died in 2000. She came of an incredibly brilliant family, the Knoxes. Her father was the editor of Punch. One of her uncles was one of the people who cracked the Enigma code at Bletchley. One of her other uncles was Ronald Knox, who in his day was a very famous Anglo-Catholic convert. So she came of this dazzling but rather eccentric, quite difficult family. She was a very brilliant student at Oxford. And then she married a handsome, dashing, as it turned out, not successful person called Desmond Fitzgerald. And she spent a long time, as women do, bringing up her family and coping with many difficult family circumstances, which we might come back to and talk about a bit more. And then she started writing, or she started publishing. She had been writing in bits. She started publishing in around the age of 60. And she became famous at 80. So this is a very hopeful story. It's very encouraging. And she became most famous with her last novel, which was a wonderful, strange masterpiece called The Blue Flower. I don't know if people know it. And that was published in 95. And she died in 2000. So she didn't follow on from that success. So in a way, it's a rather sad story. And she tells rather sad stories. But it's also a story about endurance and waiting and patience and a sort of stoicism. So I find it a very inspiring story.
But were you also sort of working backwards, starting from a sort of a late work, well, it is the work, but work late in life, and then trying to see how that might have been built?
Well, she's not like writers where you can talk about an early style and a middle style and a late style, because in a way everything was late, in that her early books were written in her 60s. But what she did was to write about her own past experiences. She had taught in a stage school, and she wrote a wonderful novel called At Freddy's about that. She'd worked in the BBC during the Second World War. She wrote a novel about that. She helped to run a bookshop in Southwold, and she wrote a novel about that called The Bookshop. And then she'd lived for a while on a barge, a leaky barge on the Thames in the early 60s, which sank. With all her possessions floating away down to the bottom of the River Thames. And out of that experience, about 18 years later, she made a novel called Offshore, which in fact won the Booker Prize in 1979, to everybody's great surprise, including her own. And then after she'd written about her own experiences, there was a definite break in the 80s, and then she moved away and wrote 4, I think, very great short novels set in other countries, other times. Innocence, The Beginning of Spring, The Gate of Angels, and The Blue Flower. And in those novels, she moves away from her own experience. So, of course, she's partly writing about herself. So there is a kind of change in the late period, definitely, yeah.
Historical novels versus...
Yes, they don't feel quite like... I mean, when we think of historical novels, we think of War and Peace or Wolf Hall. These are quite short, very spare, very subtle, very compressed books, where there's an enormous amount of knowledge and material which is sort of buried like an iceberg underneath what you actually read. But they give you the extraordinary impression that she knows everything there is to know about Russia before the revolution, or Italy just after the Second World War, times like that, where she seems to inhabit these worlds completely.
And so your work, in a way, as a biographer, was not just to tell the life, but to show why her work was worth reading. Did you feel that? More so than someone like Virginia Woolf?
Yes. With Virginia Woolf, you don't need to do a rescue operation. You might need to change the emphasis. With Penelope Fitzgerald, I really did feel that this was a really extraordinary, exceptional English writer who had been somewhat neglected and was beginning to be more neglected, I think, since her death. And so, in a way, yes, it was a kind of resuscitation or a kind of rescuing or a bringing back to life, which for me was a very important part of the operation. And I had been asked to do it by the family, so I had their archive and I had their blessing, which was very helpful to me, and I couldn't have otherwise done it.
Yeah. And what do you think of the work? I mean, what can you say about why it should be thought to be of value now?
Her work? Well, I think she is a very remarkable English novelist who is deeply interested in European and non-English models. So when I think of her, there's a tendency to put her in a box with someone like Barbara Pym or Beryl Bainbridge or Stevie Smith, and I don't think that's quite right, actually. I think she's more like Turgenev or Beckett. She's very, very interested in Beckett, surprisingly. And in the early 50s, she was very interested in Italian modernists like Moravia. So she has a really continental, international flavour. She doesn't write like anybody else. As I said, she just conjures up these whole historical and personal worlds with apparently very little effort, apparently very little detail. So it's rather like a conjuring trick or a sort of act of magic. You feel that you're inside these worlds without quite knowing how she's done it. All her critics used to say, how does she do it? And it's that's really what I was trying to find out and solve.
And this is very different from the people that you've written about before, because you'd met her. I mean, though you say in the book you didn't know her well, but you had, in fact, even interviewed her yourself.
Yes.
And how did that change your approach to things when you set out?
She was a very difficult person to interview. She was extremely private. She was very evasive. She liked to play games. She was rather willful. She was a good friend of Penelope Lively, and I was on a panel with Penelope Lively recently talking about Penelope Fitzgerald, and I said to Penelope Lively, what would this panel have been like if Penelope Fitzgerald had been here? And Penelope Lively said, mayhem, because she wouldn't answer any questions, and she would lie. So, for instance, when people asked her, she wrote this novel about Russia called The Beginning of Spring, which was so convincing and so persuasive. People would say to her, my God, you must have lived in Russia for years, months on end to write this novel. And sometimes she would say, yes, I've lived there for very long periods of time. And sometimes she would say, no, I've never been there in my life, just depending on how she felt. And in fact, the truth was she'd been there for 2 weeks in 1975. So she was quite tricky. So I didn't feel, I look back and I thought, my God, if I'd known I was going to write her biography, I could have asked her all kinds of personal questions that I never thought to ask at the time, but actually I would probably have been none the wiser. She wouldn't have told me anything. Yeah. So yes, I kind of knew her and I didn't know her. And that's very different from writing about Edith Wharton or Willa Cather or Virginia Woolf, where they were all safely dead.
I mean, on the one hand, there's this question of whether you actually know her much better now than you could have done had she been alive.
I think I do.
But on the other hand, how do you feel? Do you feel somehow compelled to withhold things as a biographer? I mean, do you feel more guilty almost about the project? I know that you've been asked by the family, but what is that relationship?
I don't think biography and guilt go together. I think if you're going to be a biographer, you've got to be ruthless. I mean, it doesn't mean you're an immoral and unscrupulous person necessarily, but you've got to write as if everybody's dead. Otherwise, you would constantly be taking your pen off the page, and you would be inhibited. So you've got to be bold and you've got to be ruthless, I think. And yes, she was a private person, and I think there are many things about my book she would have not liked. But at the same time, because the biography has brought people back to her books, I think that she would have liked very much.
She was also a biographer herself.
Yes.
I mean, did that affect the way you wrote about her, or did it change your feelings about how to write a biography in general, or how did that
I
feel?
would have liked to be able to write my biography in the way she wrote hers, but I didn't succeed in doing that. Her biographies are short, and they are quite novelistic, and I'm not a novelist. And she's very evocative in the way she writes biography, and which I do try to be. But I think there's a wonderful biography of a poet called Charlotte Mew. I don't know if anybody knows her work. And Charlotte Mew, she thought of as a kind of ventriloquist, someone who was completely brilliant at inhabiting other people's voices and impersonating other people. And in a way, I think Penelope Fitzgerald, as a biographer, thought of herself as a kind of impersonator, which I think is a wonderful thing to be if you're a biographer, to sort of disappear inside the other person's life. But I'm not sure that I succeeded in doing that.
It's an interesting view. I mean, you write at the end of the book about these. I've written this, the sense of the speaking presence of gaps and silences, and this question that you raise of the things that she wouldn't have wanted you to know, not just things that you found, in fact, things that you couldn't know. How did you deal with that? I mean, can you give us some examples of the sort of thing that eluded you, in fact?
Well, when she was interviewed in her later life, when she had become a well-known novelist herself, there were a whole tranche of things she would never talk about. So she never talked about the fact that her husband was an alcoholic and that he was sacked from his lawyer's firm because he had been stealing money from the firm. She never talked about the time when the family was so poor that when they went on sort of cheap holidays because her husband became a travel agent's clerk, they used to go into a series of restaurants and they would pick up the menus and they would eat the bread and and dunk the bread in the olive oil, and then they would throw down the menu as if there was nothing for them to eat, and then go on to the next restaurant, have some more free bread. So things like that. She didn't talk about to interviews. She didn't talk about the fact that her son married very young a Spanish girl whom she'd never met. And this was for her a kind of tragedy. She would never talk about those things. Similarly, although she once said that she fell deeply in love at the BBC with someone much older than her, she never said who it was. She never talks about that. For all I know, she could have been having a massive double life and a hectic secret love life, which I never found out about. But if you're a biographer, you can't make things up. You can only go on what you've been told. You can make a few guesses, but you must never say, I imagine she would have done this. I think that's wrong. I don't think biographers should do that. I think you can only go on the information you've got. That's the difference between being a biographer and being a novelist.
And so, but what about the processes then? How do you find those things out if someone is almost intent on your not finding them out?
You go and talk to as many people as you possibly can, and you have to leave the gaps of things you don't know. I mean, you find things out from other people usually.
Which could be gossip.
Yeah, it can be gossip. Yeah.
But on the other hand, in her case, she was so economical in her writing that in a way you're reflecting that the mind behind that writing is exactly like that, right? It's sort of reserved and quiet in some ways.
I think I think this idea about ventriloquism is very interesting, and one of the things about writing biography for me is that you want to try not to be cravenly imitative of your subject, but to try and get across the sort of tone and texture and way of thinking of the subject. So I try to think about what I'm doing as a biographer in terms of the work of the person I'm writing about. So when I was writing about Virginia Woolf, I was very conscious that she was very impatient with the conventions of biography. So I was trying to do something about breaking down the sort of the chronology and the predictable direction of biography. When I was writing about Edith Wharton, I was very conscious that she was a material girl with enormous amounts of wealth and possessions. So I wanted the biography to be like a series of sort of richly furnished rooms. You go into the Italy room or the Henry James room, or the and with Fitzgerald, I wanted it to be more spare and perhaps a little bit indirect in the way that she is too.
What are the pitfalls, though, of having, particularly with those earlier books, not the later four, but the books that drew on her life? What are the pitfalls of interpreting the life through the work, or the other way around?
Well, if somebody lives on a barge on the Thames in the early 60s, which sinks, and they write a novel about someone living on a barge in the early 60s, you, I think, are entitled to feel that there is some relationship between the life and the work. But then what you have to look for are the differences. So I'm very impatient with the kind of biography that takes Virginia Woolf and says, that character in The Waves is T.S. Eliot, or that character in Mrs. Dalloway is Ottilie Morell. What I'm interested in is, what is the whole complicated negotiation that goes on that takes you from the person living your life who knows people and has relationships with people to the staging, the performance of some of those characters and relationships in a metamorphosed narrative. So I'm interested in the differences between the life and the work, as well as in the similarities. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
You have to hold the two together in your head all the time. It's like a kind of balancing act, I think.
Yeah, and in fact, what you do so well is incorporate the literary criticism. So you're working on the book, within the book. You don't have to be talking exclusively about the life. You know, if you're talking about Offshore, then you will give us a reading of Offshore. I think lots of biographers don't do it, can't do it, you know, aren't so good at the criticism itself.
Well, I think it's like two books in one. So if you're not interested in the literary criticism, you can just skip that bit and go on to the story. I mean, I started as a literary critic, and I think I got out of literary criticism and went into biography because I couldn't stand literary theory, so I needed a refuge in biography. And so I do come to writing biography from the point of view of being a great admirer of the work, and I want to put my thoughts about the work and how it relates to the life into the biography, because that seems to me the point of writing biography. I couldn't write a biography of an ice skater or a politician or a mountaineer or a gardener, because I'm not, you know, those aren't my primary interests.
You're not a mountaineering critic.
No.
And then in I can't remember whether it's in Body Parts or in the biography book, where you talk about Carlyle's comment about sympathy being essential.
Yes.
Do you think that? I mean, can you have too much of that?
I wrote a collection of essays on biography, which is called Body Parts, because it began with the story of Shelley's heart and whether Shelley's heart survived the fire on the beach after he was burnt. So I thought these missing parts are sort of very interesting metaphor, really, for what happens in biography. And I was thinking about 19th century attitudes to biography, and Carlyle, who, in spite of his horrible political opinions, is something of a hero of mine, because he was so interested in biography and wrote so well about it. And Carlyle says the great secret of biography is to have an open, loving heart, which is a very interesting 19th century thing to say, because I don't think now, if I was to ask any of you, what is the first secret of writing biography, I doubt if you would say to have an open, loving heart. But actually, I think human sympathy is terribly important. And I can't imagine working on a writer who I didn't like or admire. I can't imagine setting out to spend 5 years of my life with someone in order to do a hatchet job on them. I mean, it's just the time, apart from anything else. You know, you get older and grayer, and everybody else is living their life and doing other things, and there you are just living with this person in this imaginary world. So it's a big investment of time, you know. So I think you've got to like them in order to make that investment, without without wanting to write uncritical hagiography. You know, you've got to tell the truth about the person. And it's not always pleasant. You know, Virginia Woolf did some horrible things and said some horrible things. Edith Wharton said some horrible things. Penelope Fitzgerald could be extremely difficult and perverse. And that has to go in. You know, her husband was dying. She sat at his bedside in the hospital. She said, "It's my publication day and nobody cares." And a few weeks later, he was dead. Now, that is not the remark of a particularly necessarily amiable person. You know, that's quite a perverse thing to do. But I understand completely why she did it, because she'd been waiting and waiting and waiting to publish her first book. Just so happened that her husband was dying at the same time. You know, but those are kind of paradoxes about people that you have to put down. You can't walk around them, however much you admire them.
Yeah. Well, what are the things that a biographer should never do, do you think?
I don't think you should say, "He must have."
All right.
I don't think you should say, looking back on that moment, he would realize that his life had been forever changed. Because actually one's life doesn't work like that. And I don't think one should make things up. I don't think one should make up dialogue when you don't know what people said to each other. And I don't think one should be sentimental, if possible, though it's sometimes quite hard when you got involved with the person. And when I was writing about Virginia Woolf, I very much resisted the idea that the whole life could be seen as a movement towards the death. You know, there are a lot of readings of Virginia Woolf that read back from her suicide and see everything in terms of that suicide, or define all the work in terms of a writer who was going to commit suicide. And I don't like that kind of determinist reading of a life. I like to keep the sense while I'm writing that other things could have happened, that the end that we know about is not necessarily the end that was going to be. So I think biography should have sense of alternatives.
Yes.
If that makes sense.
Yes. There's that quote. You also quote Henry James talking about smoothing over. So someone is smoothed over in your memory, a dead person is.
Yes.
And in fact, also, I don't think that smoothed over isn't the phrase, is it? Smooth the folds or something like that.
Smoothing over
Sorry.
is right. Yeah.
And so in fact, paradoxically, you're trying to make them more nebulous. I mean, that seems wrong somehow, that if you're writing a book, the book itself has to have a shape, but you're also trying to suggest that lives don't work in strict shapes.
If you think about the shape of your own life, I mean, you don't necessarily see a sort of a sort of forward arch or a sense of smooth, inevitable progress. You probably, if you think about the shape of your own life, you probably see it more in sort of fits and starts, or bumps, or patches, or bits that are exciting and bits that are really dull, or bits that are tremendously repetitive, and then bits in which everything comes together or falls apart. I don't think any of us sees our life in a sort of wonderful, arch. And so I think biography has to try and avoid that sense of everything fits, everything leads to something else, everything is smoothed over. There aren't any problems, there aren't any prickles, there aren't any gaps. I think biography ought to reflect the kind of awkwardness and irregularity of people's lives. And that's very difficult because you've got, 200,000 words, 160,000 words. You probably want to divide it up into chapters because otherwise the reader would get incredibly frustrated and bored if it was all one great long thing. So you have to find stopping points, at the end of each chapter. So there's a tendency to say, this marks the end of a 10-year phase of her life or something, and you go on to chapter 6. So there's a great temptation towards making things beautifully shaped and formed. And yet the life itself is probably likely to be quite messy and quite turbulent in its shape. And that's, for me, the fascination. Any form of writing is an artifice. Any narrative has an artificial structure to it. Even if you say you start on the first page with the birth and you end on the last page with the death, that's an artificial structure. But within that artifice, which you have to have in order to make it readable, you've got to represent the complexity of the life. So that's the job, I think.
And where are you standing I mean, in relation to the subject, supposing they're in a room, are you showing how their life looks to them? No.
Yeah. It's a very, very good question. I mean, one of the questions you have to ask yourself when you're writing biography is, do you think of your subject as younger than you or as older than you? You know, because your attitude changes, actually. If you think of the person as younger, you tend to feel sort of protective towards them. You know, if you think of them as older, you tend to feel awed, you know, because of what they've done. And obviously, it's a mixture of the two. I mean, where you're standing as a writer, and all writers in this space know this, you are standing by virtue of your gender, your age, your race, your education, your class, your nationality. You know, if you're writing a biography of someone, you don't throw those things overboard. Those are the things that you bring to the table. You can't avoid those things. So you're bound to be writing from a perspective, even if you think you're being as objective as it's possible to be. As long as you're in the room with the person, I don't think it really matters whether you're lying down or standing up or looking down from the ceiling. The intimacy is what you want. The closeness is what you want. But Richard Holmes has a wonderful, very famous piece about biography in that lovely book, Footsteps. I don't know if you know that, where he talks about the broken bridge, in Avignon, where you can get to the end of the broken bridge and you can look across at the other side, but you can't quite cross because the person is not you and they're apart from you in history, but you can get as close as you possibly can, and yet the bridge is still going to be broken. And I find that a very moving image for the writing of biography.
Oh, that's lovely. I think we have to let you ask some questions, although I should say that you're working on Tom Stoppard next.
Yeah.
And there's nothing yet to say about that.
Nothing yet to say.
Except good luck from us.
Thank you. Yeah.
So please do raise your hand if you have a question.
I guess you have to shout and bellow because
yes, there's a mic. Very good.
There is a mic. Oh, okay.
We can carry on if not. But
you have this lady here has a question.
Thank you.
Yeah. Gosh, it's quite...
Sorry, I'm not a writer of any kind, but just interested. Like that? Yes. I was interested in what you said about the arch of people's lives and things. Surely what a biographer must recognize is the fact that human beings are not consistent, and that really what you have to show are the inconsistencies in that human being without making people feel that they don't have an arc of life.
Yes, I think that's right. When I was writing about Virginia Woolf, you have an astonishing advantage with Virginia Woolf because you've got the letters, you've got a lot of letters, and you've got a diary, which is amazing. Would that every writer had written a diary as copious as Virginia Woolf. So you can have a completely different reflection on practically the same day on an event. And indeed, you will have letters written to different people about the same event. So you will have quite an internalized, reflective passage in the diary about what she's writing, for instance, on a particular day when she's also being very social and seeing a lot of people. And so that doubleness in her, that gregarious, outward-going, social, gossipy, scandalous side of her, where she loved to entertain and be entertained, is coexisting alongside a very private, rather obscure, quite silent part of her, where she's trying to work out what she's going to write next. I think we all do this. I think we all have this secret, private part of ourselves, and then all this stuff. And so I think that's a very important inconsistency for writers, because when they're out there, they're often gathering the material of what they're going to write about. But when they're in there, they don't want to think about the outside world. Also, you will have the contradictions with her that she will write to, as it might be, Ottilie Morell and say, you know, meeting you is the most wonderful thing that's ever happened to me in my life. You know, I can't tell you how marvelous it was, you know. And then on the same day, she will write to her sister and say, yeah, we met Ottilie Morell. She wasn't quite as stupid as I had been led to believe, you know. So you get those kinds of very wicked inconsistencies, which, of course, is another thing we all do. Which is why you must always be so careful with your email not to press reply all. We've all done that.
Has anyone else got a question?
You talk about liking to find the differences between what happened in someone's real life and how they might have used that in fiction. As a fiction writer myself, and all the novelists I know, we use loads of stuff from around ourselves every day.
Yeah.
I use actual words people said, actual things they did. But those have nothing to do with my fictional character at all. In the same way I might use all the landscapes I've lived in to create a fictional one. So I would find it quite scary that a biographer might say, well, actually her friend so-and-so did say this or do this, because it's nothing to do with it. So maybe why draw those parallels at all? And is it because she's a particularly autobiographical novelist?
But the person reading your biography is going to be very fascinated to find out precisely that you used something which someone living next door to you had said to you one morning and put that into the mouth of a completely other kind of character, because that is very, very revealing about the process of putting the creative work together. So the biographer's job is to unpick. Your job is to fuse and mix and make magic out of the everyday experience that you encounter. And then the brutal biographer comes along, like some horrible cross between a detective and a psychoanalyst, and starts picking it apart and finding the bits. It's bound to be in opposition. You're bound to hate me. You know, if I were your biographer, you'd be bound to hate me. That's how it works, I think. The biographer is always, in a way, working against what the creative writer was trying to do, because the biographer is unpicking for the benefit of posterity.
I'd be more worried about the people who I've used in that way, and I'm always assuring them, I've used one sentence you said because I liked it, or one thing you did merge with a load of other people. The biographer might never.
Yeah, you could be in trouble when the biographer comes along.
Kill them off first, Simon. Well, we've got time for one more question, I think, if someone had some. Yes, it's just right next to you. Thank you.
I was wondering about whether you think there can be such a thing as an authentic memoir. What do you think is the difference between writing a biography about someone else and someone who's writing a biography about themselves?
Yes, I think that authentic memoir is a very viable and persuasive notion. I think that we're all very aware of the unreliability of memory. I've been thinking a bit about Isaiah Berlin, who was the founder of the college that I run in Oxford, Wolfson College. And Isaiah Berlin had a very famous encounter with Anna Akhmatova in St. Petersburg in 1945. And he wrote down the story of this encounter in 1988, having told it many times in between. And he wrote it down as if he'd had a tape recorder in the room. He wrote it down as if Akhmatova was talking to him then and there. So you necessarily ask yourself, what is the reliability of this memoir? You know, did he really remember everything she said? Did he remember it by dint of having repeated it so often in conversation with people? So I think any memoir is going to be, in a way, fraudulent. Any memoir is going to be based on the reconstructions that memory does. You know, memory is a form of reconstruction, and it gets reconstructed. Things get reconstructed through narrative, through telling them. But then what you think you remember is sometimes as true as what actually happened. Anyway.
Thank you. I think that's it. I think that's all we have time for. So thank you very much for coming. Please do join me in thanking Hermione for being here. Thank you.